Imagine a human body that can just wake up, run 6 miles at a dead sprint, and then immediately head to an oil sands site to work a 16-hour manual labor shift.
Right, which is just an incredible amount of output.
It's wild. But now imagine that same exact body, just a few years later, left completely immobilized, gasping for air just from the sheer physical effort of making a single waffle.
Yeah, the contrast is just staggering.
It really is. What happens to a person's mind when their physical universe shrinks that drastically? I mean, when the machine they've relied on their entire life just suddenly stops taking orders.
Well, it creates this massive crisis of identity, one that most of us really can't even begin to fathom,
Right.
because we tend to view physical exhaustion as a penalty. Right. It's like the red warning light on the dashboard telling you that you've overdrawn your biological bank account.
Exactly. Time to pull over.
Yeah. But when you are forced to cross the threshold into profound physical limitation, that entire paradigm flips. Exhaustion actually stops being a punishment.
Which is such a wild concept to wrap your head around. But welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're unpacking this fascinating and honestly highly intimate source text.
Yeah, it's simply titled The Gift of Being Tired.
Right. And our mission today is to explore the insights hidden within this short but incredibly dense account of extreme physical transformation.
We're going to examine how our relationship with physical exertion, really shapes who we are.
And what happens internally when our bodily capacity is just drastically and irreversibly altered.
And maybe most importantly, the surprising mental peace that can actually be found when you hit absolute physical limitation.
Yeah. So for you listening right now, have you ever considered exhaustion to be a luxury?
It sounds like a paradox.
It does, but by the end of this conversation, you will likely view your own tiredness and your own daily anxieties through an entirely new lens.
Let's look at why sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is, well, simply not having the energy to worry.
So to really grasp the endpoint of this author's journey, we have to start at the extreme opposite end of the spectrum.
Oh, absolutely. We have to look at the baseline they operated from before their body changed.
And that baseline was a level of physical output that just completely defies modern conventions of labor. Or endurance, really.
Yeah, let's lay out the parameters of that past life. The source text begins by establishing a contrast that is, frankly, hard to even conceptualize.
The author describes this life of just relentless physical capacity. We are talking about waking up and going for a 6-mile run in the morning.
Which is a solid workout for most people.
Right. But for them, that was just the warm-up. Because after that run, they would go to work, and the standard shift was 11 hours.
11 hours was often the minimum. The text specifies that when they were working in Ontario,
Right, sometimes in the oil sands.
yeah, or in other heavy industries, they would routinely pull 14 or even 16-hour days.
And the justification for those 16-hour days is what really, it just caught my eye immediately.
What stood out to you?
They wrote that they worked that long, and I quote, just because the sun was up.
Wow.
They
Great.
stopped only to eat a meal or drink water and then went right back to manual labor. Their body, as they describe it, was just constantly producing enough energy to sustain maximum output.
That phrase, just because the sun was up, is incredibly telling from a sociological perspective.
How so?
Well, in our modern context, we regulate our labor with highly artificial structures.
Right.
We have digital calendars, shift schedules, union mandates.
The 9-to-5 corporate clock.
Exactly. But this author completely bypassed the industrial clock. They tied their human labor to the primal, astronomical rhythm of daylight.
It's raw. It's almost this feral level of productivity. It really makes me think about what a 16-hour manual labor shift actually does to a human body.
It's not gentle, that's for sure.
No, because I read this and I can't help but picture the author's past body as this high-voltage internal combustion engine, like one that literally couldn't be shut off.
That's a great way to visualize it.
But any machine running at that high of an RPM generates massive amounts of heat and friction, right? It creates wear and tear.
Constant friction.
So I have to ask you, as the expert here, was a body producing energy for 16 hours of manual labor actually sustaining itself? Or was it inevitably borrowing against its own future?
Biologically speaking, you cannot run an engine at the red line indefinitely without structural consequences.
I figured.
When we talk about sustaining a 16-hour manual labor shift, we are talking about a massive, continuous drain on the body's glycogen stores.
And glycogen is what, exactly?
It's the stored form of glucose in your muscles and liver. It's your quick access fuel. Once you burn through that, Your body has to start metabolizing fat.
Okay, so fat burning kicks in.
Right, but eventually, if you aren't careful, it starts metabolizing muscle tissue just to keep the internal furnace burning.
Wait, so they are essentially eating themselves to keep moving.
To a degree, yes, unless their caloric intake was just astronomically high. Furthermore, living in that state means your endocrine system is constantly flooded with cortisol and adrenaline.
Just to suppress the pain, right?
Exactly, to suppress pain and maintain alertness.
Yeah.
Your cellular repair mechanisms, the processes that fix the micro tears in your muscles and the inflammation in your joints, they require deep, extended parasympathetic rest.
Which they weren't getting.
No. When 16-hour manual labor days are your standard, sleep isn't really rest. Sleep becomes merely a brief utilitarian pause to clear metabolic waste from the brain before the engine is fired up again.
Wow.
Over time, that level of continuous cellular debt compounds.
But a body doesn't just naturally sustain 16 hours of hard labor without a catalyst, you know?
Right? You need a spark.
You don't just roll out of bed, stretch your arms, and casually decide to go move mountains. The author actually had to hack their own biology every single morning to jumpstart that engine.
And that is exactly where the 6-mile morning run comes in. And the source makes it very clear that this was not a leisurely morning jog to clear the head or, like, enjoy the sunrise.
No, not at all.
It was a highly structured, aggressive interval protocol.
Yeah, let's break down exactly what this ritual entailed, because it's intense. They would start by slowly speeding up to a jog for about 20 minutes.
Right.
Then the escalation begins. For the next 5 minutes, they increase their speed every single minute. Then they increased it every 30 seconds.
Building the momentum.
Exactly. And for the final 30 seconds of the run, they described running, quote, full tilt as fast as we possibly could.
An all-out sprint.
Yes. Only after that maximum lung-burning sprint would they finally cut it off to a slow walk down.
You know, the mechanics of that run are fascinating because the author explicitly states their motivation. It wasn't for cardiovascular health.
It wasn't to train for a marathon or anything.
No. They did it because this intense physical bouncing. They specifically note that it moved the stomach a lot. It actually kickstarted their digestion.
It woke them up naturally.
Exactly. They explicitly compare the physiological effect of this intense physical agitation to what coffee does artificially.
Wait, okay, hold on. So they engineered a literal, violent physical agitation of their internal organs to wake up.
Yeah.
Like they bounced their stomach until their digestive tract was forced online.
That is exactly what they were doing. What we are talking about here is gastric motility.
Okay, unpack that.
The human digestive system is heavily influenced by the enteric nervous system and by physical movement. When you run, the physical impact of your foot striking the ground sends a shockwave up your kinetic chain.
Just boom, boom, boom up the leg.
Right. That mechanical agitation, combined with the massive increase in blood flow required to sustain a sprint, forces the smooth muscle of the intestines to start contracting.
Oh, wow.
It literally forces the metabolic processes to wake up.
Does this suggest that, like, most of us have completely lost touch with our own biology? I mean, think about the average morning routine.
It's pretty different.
Right. You listening right now, you probably groggily stumble into the kitchen, brew a pot of coffee, and sit at a desk.
Yes.
We are outsourcing our wakefulness to a bean.
We absolutely outsource our physiological processes. The author acutely observes that in the modern world, we do stuff to try and make happen what should be entirely natural.
Right.
Let's look at how coffee actually works compared to what this author was doing. Caffeine doesn't actually give you energy.
It doesn't.
No, it chemically mimics a molecule called adenosine, which is the neurotransmitter that makes you feel sleepy. The caffeine binds to your adenosine receptors, blocking the sleep signal.
Oh, I see.
It's a chemical trick. It's like putting a piece of tape over the check engine light.
That makes so much sense. So it's the difference between turning a key in an ignition and having to physically crank the engine yourself from the outside?
Yes, exactly. The author was actively generating a metabolic fire. Running full tilt as a biological alarm clock really forces us to ask a difficult question.
Riz.
How much of our daily modern lethargy, our perceived lack of energy, our sluggish digestion, our brain fog, is simply a result of relying on chemical triggers to replace the intense physical movement our human bodies actually evolved to crave?
That is a phenomenal point. But because they crank that engine so hard every morning, their baseline for movement was completely skewed compared to the rest of society.
Very true.
The text mentions that they ran everywhere and never walked. They were perpetually in high gear.
Always moving.
But a perfectly tuned machine built for constant acceleration eventually collides with a world that demands deceleration.
And that collision happens on the job site. This is where the narrative takes a sudden and honestly destructive turn.
Yeah, this part was hard to read.
Because of this natural ingrained inclination, because they literally never walked,
Mhm.
they naturally ran on their first day at a new work site.
Makes sense for them.
Right, but the foreman stopped them immediately.
Yeah, the foreman steps in and says, "What are you doing? You can't run. Everyone will think there's an emergency."
It's a strict rule.
So, to comply with the rules of the worksite, the author was forced to walk. And the source text makes a devastating connection right here. The author notes that this forced walking is precisely where their feet and legs, quote, started to deteriorate.
The irony of this moment is staggering. You have a workplace rule ostensibly designed to maintain order and safety, right?
Of course.
In an industrial environment, running implies panic. It implies a hazard, a chemical spill, a break in the protocol.
Right, it looks like something went wrong.
Exactly.
Ah.
But the enforcement of that institutional safety directly caused the biological breakdown of the worker.
It just makes no sense on the surface. Walking is inherently lower impact than running. How does forcing someone to slow down cause their legs to deteriorate?
Well, let's look at your racing analogy from earlier.
Okay, yeah. I'm imagining taking a highly specialized Formula One race car and forcing it to idle in daily bumper-to-bumper city traffic.
That's a perfect comparison.
You might look at that car and think, oh, it's going slowly, it's resting. But the car isn't resting. The engine is actively being ruined.
Right.
The spark plugs are fouling, the cooling system is failing, because that machine is engineered entirely for massive airflow and high-speed aerodynamics. It lacks the internal mechanisms to survive at a walking pace.
That is a brilliant mechanical analogy because it translates perfectly to human biomechanics.
Really? How so?
When a body adapts over years to the specific impact and gait of running, the physical architecture actually changes.
Oh, interesting.
During a run, especially at the speeds the author describes, a person typically strikes with their midfoot or forefoot. The Achilles tendon acts like a massive rubber band.
Storing the energy.
Exactly, storing kinetic energy as the foot lands and releasing it to propel the body forward. It's a highly efficient, spring-loaded system.
So the body is actively recycling its own energy.
Yes. But when you force that same person to walk, especially in heavy, rigid work boots on hard industrial surfaces, you change the entire kinetic chain.
Right, walking is a different motion entirely.
Walking requires a heavy heel strike. There is no spring action. Every time that heel hits the ground, a blunt force shock wave travels directly up the shin bone, into the knee, and into the hip joint.
Ouch.
The author's body was a machine built for continuous, elastic, high-speed movement. When forced into a heavy, plodding, unnatural gear, the shock absorption just failed. The body deteriorated.
It's a tragic example of how our built environments and, our cultural rules can be actively hostile to our individual physiology.
They absolutely can.
The author's natural healthy baseline was perceived by society as a state of alarm. And by forcing them to conform to what society deems safe, society actually broke them.
And that forced deceleration serves as the pivot point in this narrative. The breakdown of those legs transitions us away from the 16-hour shifts and the oil sands and drops us directly into the stark reality the author navigates today.
So we jump to the present, and the scale of exertion is almost microscopic by comparison.
A total shift.
The author is now navigating profound physical limitation from a wheelchair. Tasks that, in their previous life, would have been considered taking a break or basically doing nothing, now constitute monumental physical hurdles.
They are running what we might call micromarathons.
Micromarathons, I like that phrase. They recount a specific morning routine to illustrate this. They prepped a pork shoulder, they made waffles, they did the dishes, and they took the garbage and the recycling out.
And the result of that morning, they are laying there panting and exhausted.
Right.
They emphasize that even just sitting in a wheelchair to do this work, not even using the energy required to stand or balance, leaves them at a point where they literally cannot lift their arms.
Now, I want to challenge how a reader might instinctively react to this section. Because my first instinct, reading about a former extreme athlete who now can't lift their arms after making waffles, was to feel an overwhelming sense of tragedy.
Well, sure, it is the natural human reaction to profound loss of capability.
But the author completely subverts that expectation. They recount this morning of cooking and doing the dishes, and their conclusion is, quote, which was good, so we were busy.
Yes.
They don't lament the dishes, they seem to actively celebrate them. How does a human brain reconcile that? How do you shrink your physical world that drastically without completely destroying your sense of self-worth?
What you were really looking at there is a masterclass in neuroplasticity and identity recalibration.
Neuroplasticity.
Yes. For a former high-output laborer, the ego and the sense of self are deeply intertwined with physical capability. In their past life, their brain released dopamine, the reward chemical, when they completed a 16-hour shift.
Right, that was the standard.
That was the baseline required to feel valuable.
So their internal reward system was basically calibrated to extreme suffering.
Essentially, yes. To survive their current reality, they had to actively rewire that reward system. Hedonic adaptation usually refers to how we get used to positive things and need more to feel happy.
Like chasing a high.
Exactly. This author had to perform a reverse hedonic adaptation. They had to teach their brain to release that same validating dopamine hit for prepping a pork shoulder.
Which is incredible.
It requires immense psychological resilience to accept this new micro scale of exertion without festering in resentment. They successfully divorced their human value from their raw physical output.
But living this reality isn't just about adopting a positive mindset, right? It's not just psychological.
Not at all.
It involves a very real, precarious, and honestly terrifying daily negotiation with their body's internal chemistry. The text details these drastic, uncontrollable fluctuations in energy that fundamentally alter how they exist in the world.
The body is no longer a reliable machine that responds to commands. It has become an unreliable, erratic narrator of their physical capacity.
Unreliable narrator, wow.
The author describes a terrifying vulnerability in the middle of the night. If the body decides not to provide an adrenaline burst, the simple act of lifting their head or sitting up in bed feels insurmountable.
It's just lifting their head.
Yes. They say it feels like the body, quote, will totally collapse under its own weight.
What does that actually mean biologically? Why does gravity suddenly feel like a crushing force?
When you are dealing with profound chronic fatigue or systemic physical limitation, you're often dealing with mitochondrial dysfunction.
The mitochondria, like the powerhouse of the cell.
Exactly, the powerhouses of your cells. They produce ATP, which is the actual chemical currency of energy. In a healthy body, when you want to sit up, your brain sends a signal, your mitochondria produce the ATP, and your muscles contract.
Simple enough.
But in a compromised body, that supply chain is broken. The signal is sent, but there is no energy currency available. The muscles remain flaccid.
Oh, man.
The sensation of the body collapsing under its own weight is the literal neurological perception of zero cellular energy. You feel the true weight of your skeleton because the muscles have nothing to hold it up with.
And yet, they have these complete inversions. When the body arbitrarily decides to grant an adrenaline burst, when it says, yes, okay, here's the adrenaline for high production, they can suddenly push through and make the waffles and do the dishes.
Right.
But adrenaline in this context isn't a superpower. It used to be a tool they summoned on demand for a sprint. Now, they explicitly state that they must be extremely careful to stay within the bounds of what their body can handle, even when they feel flooded with this energy.
This highlights the immense discipline required not to overexert when you finally feel energetic. In the chronic illness community, this is known as the trap of the good day.
The trap of the good day.
Yeah. When you are physically limited and your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis suddenly fires off a massive dose of adrenaline, the psychological temptation is overwhelming.
I can imagine.
You want to clean the whole house, run all the errands, and reclaim your old life, if only for a few hours.
I picture this as living in a house with a fundamentally faulty electrical grid.
Oh, let's hear this one.
Imagine an old house with terrible, frayed wiring. Most of the time, the lights are dim and the fridge barely runs.
Okay, the baseline.
Then suddenly, the power company sends a massive surge down the line. The lights blaze bright, the outlets hum. The temptation is to plug in the vacuum, run the dishwasher, and turn on the oven all at once because you finally have power.
Because you haven't been able to do any of that.
Right. But you have to actively stop yourself. You have to be incredibly disciplined because you know the wiring in the walls is still frayed.
Yes.
If you use all that power, you will blow the main fuse, cause an electrical fire, and be left in complete debilitating darkness for days.
That analogy captures the exact mechanism of their reality. The adrenaline surge is deceptive. It masks the structural limits of the body.
Right, it's fake power.
Adrenaline shuts down the body's pain receptors and fatigue signals, tricking the brain into thinking the battery is full.
Oh.
But the battery isn't full. The body's just ignoring the empty gauge. If they push beyond their bounds, while under the influence of that adrenaline, The subsequent crash when the adrenaline wears off and the true cellular debt comes due, it will be catastrophic.
Hmm.
They're operating an adrenaline economy where debt is collected mercilessly and with massive interest.
And this profound disconnect between what the body is briefly tricked into wanting to do during a surge and what it can sustainably achieve, it leads to what I think is the most poetic and heartbreaking realization in the entire source text.
Yes, the author expresses a deep, highly specific yearning for a physical sensation they can no longer achieve.
Yeah.
They state that there was something about getting the heart to really pump that felt deeply engaging, and they miss it.
They write that it feels like they are missing a part of themselves, and they
Yeah.
coin this incredible phrase, almost like a phantom limb, but for the heart.
It's so visceral.
Now, we've all heard of phantom limb syndrome, but usually in the context of a missing arm or leg. How does that concept apply to an internal organ?
To deconstruct this metaphor, we need to look at the neurology of a traditional phantom limb. In your brain, there is a region called the somatosensory cortex.
Okay.
It contains a literal map of your entire body. When an arm is amputated, the physical arm is gone, but the representation of that arm in the somatosensory cortex remains active.
The map is still there.
Exactly. The brain continues to send and expects signals from that void, resulting in the sensation that the limb is still there, which often causes phantom pain.
But the author's heart isn't missing. They logically note that it doesn't make literal sense because the heart is obviously still there, beating in their chest to keep them alive.
Exactly. But they can no longer feel it the same way. The physiological reality presented is that their cardiovascular system is capped. They say the body just can't use enough blood to hit those high performance peaks.
Right.
When you engage in extreme exertion, like a 6-mile sprint, your stroke volume, the amount of blood pumped with each beat, and your heart rate both max out. The heart hits the rib cage. The pulse pounds in the ears.
I know that feeling.
The author's somatosensory cortex remembers the sheer percussive violence of a heart operating at absolute maximum capacity. But their current physical limitation prevents them from ever reaching the exertion threshold required to trigger that sensation again.
So they are grieving an internal sensory experience. It makes me wonder about the nature of this grief.
How do you mean?
Well, are they grieving an emotional numbness? Or are they literally physically missing the sensation of blood pounding in their chest that used to validate their existence?
I believe it is a deeply intertwined combination of both. Interoception is the sense of the internal state of the body. It's how we feel our own internal organs.
Interoception, okay.
When we lose the ability to push ourselves to the point where our internal organs speak loudly to us, we lose a fundamental metric of feeling alive.
Wow, yeah.
For this author, that pounding heart was the metronome of their existence. It meant they were engaged, passionate, deeply involved in the friction of the physical world.
They were in the game.
Right. Without the ability to reach that threshold, the quiet, steady, resting beat of their heart feels like a void. It feels like a missing limb.
It's the ghost of a heartbeat that can never physically happen again. It is a mourning of the peak.
And yet, despite this visceral sense of loss, despite the daily battle against physical collapse and the careful management of a faulty adrenaline grid, the narrative doesn't end in despair.
It really doesn't.
It arrives at a deeply unexpected conclusion about their new state of being.
Which brings us to the core thesis of the entire text. The surprising gift of being tired.
The real focus of all of this.
The culmination of this incredibly arduous physical journey is the author's realization that genuine, thorough exhaustion is a profound relief. They state point blank that when the body is actually tired, when energy is genuinely spent and exhausted naturally, it is better than any pain medication.
They even go so far as to say it's better than drinking or any of the other artificial ways people try to cope or numb themselves.
Which is saying something.
We have to analyze why physical exhaustion is elevated to this supreme status.
The author gives us the reason, and it's brilliant in its simplicity. They say, quote, "The brain can't register enough to work about all that kind of stuff right now.
Simple but true.
After cooking all morning and doing the dishes, they get to just relax." They describe this simple exhaustion as nice. They're not worrying. They're not in pain. They're just being around.
Right.
How does physical exhaustion act as a painkiller?
To understand this, we have to look at the neurobiology of worry. In the human brain, there is a network called the default mode network, or DMN.
DMN, all right.
The DMN is highly active when you are awake, but not focused on the outside world. It is the part of the brain responsible for daydreaming, self-reflection, and crucially, rumination, and anxiety.
Ah, the worry center.
Yes, when you have excess unspent physical energy, the DMN has abundant fuel to spin up worst-case scenarios and fixate on chronic pain.
It's almost as if unspent physical energy is the raw material for mental worry.
That's a good way to put it.
Like, if you leave a surplus of energy lying around in your system, the brain will inevitably find something to do with it, and it usually chooses to invent anxieties.
Precisely. But by exhausting the body, even through these newly scaled micromarathons like making waffles, the author is draining the global energy reserves of the body.
Just emptying the tank.
The brain is an incredibly energy-hungry organ. It consumes about 20% of your body's total energy. When you hit genuine physical exhaustion, the body enters an energy conservation mode.
It shuts down the non-essentials.
It downregulates the default mode network. The mind is finally starved of the fuel it needs to worry. It's forced into quiet compliance.
I picture this level of sheer physical exhaustion as acting like a pair of biological noise-canceling headphones for the brain.
I like that analogy.
Think about how those headphones work. They don't block sound physically. They actively listen to the ambient noise and emit an inverse wave to cancel it out. But they require a battery to do that.
Right, they need power.
The author has discovered that by draining their internal battery through physical tasks, they shut out the constant static of anxiety, the hum of chronic pain, and the overwhelming noise of the outside world.
The system just can't power the anxiety anymore.
Exactly. The system powers down to save itself, and in that powered down state, there is absolute peace.
That phrase they use, just being around, is steeped in sheer relief. It is the ultimate anchor to the present moment. You cannot worry about the future or regret the past when your immediate overriding biological reality is the deep satisfaction of a body that has spent all it has to give for the day.
Right.
They have reframed what society views as a severe physical limitation, extreme fatigue from minor tasks, into a protective mechanism for the mind.
It's beautiful, really.
The body's inability to produce endless energy anymore is precisely what saves the author from the torment of an overactive, anxious brain.
So gathering all these threads together, we have journeyed from the extremes of 16-hour oil sands shifts and hyper-calibrated stomach-churning morning sprints.
Such a long way from where they started.
We've looked at the heartbreaking physical deterioration triggered by a simple workplace rule against running. We've explored the adrenaline economy, the phantom limb of a racing heart, and finally, the quiet, exhausted triumph of making a meal from a wheelchair.
Yeah.
The author has shown us that true, unadulterated peace might surprisingly be found in the biological inability to overthink.
And this brings us to why this deeply personal narrative matters to the listener.
Right, why should they care?
Why should you, going about your daily routine, care about this story of extreme physical transition?
Yeah.
Because all of us, without exception, will inevitably face shifts in our physical or mental
I
capacity.
mean, it's a universal truth.
We age, we face illness, we encounter limitations that force us to slow down.
This narrative fundamentally challenges how you measure your own worth on your lowest energy days. It asks you to stop looking at your own exhaustion as a failure of productivity or, a penalty for not optimizing your life well enough.
Yeah.
It invites you to view your tiredness as a hard-earned state of rest, a state where the noise stops.
It is a reminder that the capacity to do more is not always synonymous with the capacity to feel better.
Exactly. Which leaves us with one final building idea for you to mull over.
Leave them with something to think about.
Think about your own week. Think about that Friday afternoon crash when you feel totally depleted, but your mind is still racing with everything you didn't get done.
We all know that feeling.
If this author's profound anxieties and chronic pains were entirely silenced simply by spending their limited physical energy,
Yeah.
what if the modern epidemic of overthinking, of constant low-grade anxiety, isn't entirely a psychological problem to be solved with more therapy or more medication?
That's a huge question.
What if it's actually a physical one? What if we are a society sitting entirely too still at desks, holding onto massive internal reserves of unspent physical energy, simply because we haven't earned the natural thought silencing gift of being truly physically tired?